Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to spend your time with me. We've done it. We've found our way to part 2 of our second killer couple story. That's right. This is part 2 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, if you haven't heard part 1 yet, please go back and listen to that. It came out last Sunday. Then come rejoin us here at part 2, and we'll be ready to rock. Get as comfortable as you can. Make sure your mind is in the mood for murder, and follow me back to the early 1930s, smack dab in the middle of Bonnie and Clyde's reckless robbing rampage. It's Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde, Part 2. Kinda Murdery starts now. Shortly before noon, Saturday, August 14, 1932, Deputy Sheriff Joe Johns was patrolling the streets of Carlsbad, New Mexico, a town in the southeast corner of the state, 80 miles west of the Texas line. A Ford V8 sedan passed him. He glimpsed the license number. He had received a report earlier that a car bearing that number had been stolen. Speeding up, he drove alongside the car and forced it to the curb. 2 men were in the front seat. The rear seat was occupied by a woman with bright yellow hair. The deputy explained that he wanted to check the motor number. Drawing his revolver and watching the men from the corner of his eye, he raised the hood. He was astonished to hear the woman's voice say, "Pile in here or I'll blow you up." The shotgun pointed at him was held with a steady hand. The officer did not have a fighting chance to use his revolver. To resist meant certain death and no possible advantage. Reluctantly, the officer got in the car and was whisked away. Witnesses reported the kidnapping to authorities. Deadly fear swept over the friends of John's as the abductors were described to them. There seemed to be no doubt that the luckless man had fallen into the hands of Barrow, Hamilton, and Bonnie Parker. Swiftly, a thorough search was instituted, but night came with no word from John's. Each passing hour lessened the chances of his escaping alive. Sunday morning, all hope for him was abandoned. Searchers went into the hills to find his body. Toward noon, the dreaded word came that a body had been found in an arroyo and identified by a chance acquaintance as that of John's. Sadly, the comrades of the slain deputy went to bring the body to town. Reverently, they gathered about the still sheet-covered figure. One of them exposed the face. There was exclamations of surprise. There had been a mistake. The body was not that of John's. Later, it was identified as the body of a hitchhiker. Late Sunday, the missing deputy telephoned his home from San Antonio, Texas. He had been carried on a mad ride of more than 1,000 miles. The bandits, who admitted they were the Barrow gang, had disarmed him and set him free on a lonely road near San Antonio. The endurance of the outlaws was remarkable. Even the long ride with Johns did not exhaust them enough to force arrest. W. Pittman, Marshal of Wharton, Texas, received a long-distance phone call about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of August 15th. The marshal at Edna, Texas, warned Pittman that a Ford V8 sedan, stolen at Victoria, had passed through Edna, apparently headed toward Wharton. Calling on Deputy Sheriff C.R. Siebrecht and F.F. Damon for help, Marshal Pittman rushed to the bridge over the Colorado River, which offered a strategic place to set a trap. Siebrecht was placed about 300 yards from the bridge on the Edna side. Pittman and Damon were concealed at the other end. When the car was sighted, Siebrecht was to signal. The others would block their end. The car would be trapped. Tensely, the officers waited. Then came the signal. A Ford coupe carrying a man and a woman with yellow hair swept around the bend, followed by a sedan driven by a man. When the cars were well on the bridge, Damon and Pittman stepped out, riot guns in their hands. Shotgun slugs sang around them. The cars spun in the wide roadway and rushed back toward Siebrecht. Guns roared from both. The deputy bravely stood his ground and returned fire. On and on rushed the cars, and the occupants still shooting. Just in time to escape being crushed under the wheels, the deputy stepped aside. The cars sped on. Leaping into their car, the officers gave chase. After a mile and a half, they found the coupe abandoned. The sedan had too long a lead, they could not overtake it. Examining the coupe, they found the revolver and holster taken from Deputy Johns. Fingerprints of Clyde Barrow were on the rearview mirror. Within the next month, Barrow and Hamilton swept from one side of the state to the other. They were identified in the robbery of an interurban station at Grand Prairie, Texas. An interurban station, by the way, is an electric railway station between two towns. They twice robbed the bank at Cedar Hill, and underworld rumors said that Barrow and Hamilton split up after the bank robberies. Apparently that was true, because when next heard from, Barrow and Bonnie Parker seemed to be working alone. A young man walked into the grocery store operated at Vaden and Wells Streets in Sherman, Texas by S.R. Little, a former city councilman, at about 6:40 on the evening of October 11, 1932. Homer Glaze, the clerk, and Howard Hall, the 67-year-old butcher, were alone in the store preparing to close. The man, a small fellow, wore a suede lumber jacket and a hat pulled low over his eyes. For a moment he looked about uncertainly. Glaze, taking him for a newcomer in the neighborhood, walked forward, introduced himself, and inquired the customer's name. The man merely grunted a response and ordered some bread and eggs. He stayed near Glaze while the clerk filled the order and handed him $1 in payment. The clerk opened the cash register to make change. Suddenly he felt hot breath on his neck and heard these whispered words. "Give me that money." A revolver jammed against his spine. The bandit's right hand reached into the register and extracted $50. Hall, from his place behind the meat counter, saw everything. Several years before, when he operated a store of his own, he had faced a like situation. He had disarmed a large bandit, and he would disarm this little fellow. The old butcher, as he walked around his counter, towered head and shoulders over the man who held Glaze at his mercy. "Well, you can't do that, young man." Hall spoke firmly. The bandit whirled toward Hall, a sneer on his face. "I can't I?" Coolly, deliberately, he swung his gun at the butcher's head. Blood spurted from an ugly gash. Hall cried with rage. He lunged at the bandit and encircled him with his arms. The outlaw placed the muzzle of his revolver in the pit of the butcher's stomach and pulled the trigger. Hall groaned with pain as the bullet tore through him. He staggered, but his hold on the smaller man did not relax. Glaze tried to close in. The bandit jerked his gun arm free and sent the clerk reeling with a blow on the forehead. Hall's strength failed rapidly. Still, he clung to his man, but inch by inch the bandit dragged him toward the alley door. They reached the threshold and fell outside in a struggling heap. The bandit twisted free. He stood over the prostrate Hall, cursing. Elsie Butler, a delivery clerk, was in the rear yard of the store putting his car away for the night. His wife was waiting for him. Street lights made it possible for Mr. and Mrs. Butler to see the bandit plainly. The killer raised his weapon. The already dying man made a last, desperate effort to close with his assailant. 3 more shots blasted into his body. He lay still. The form of Glaze appeared in the doorway. The bandit raised his revolver and pulled the trigger. The hammer clicked. The cartridge failed to explode. Darting across the vacant lot behind the grocery store, the bandit reached the street. He leapt into a black sedan that had been cruising around the block with a woman at the wheel. The car roared away. Hall was still alive when officers arrived. He was quickly removed to St. Vincent's Sanitarium just across the street, where he died 45 minutes later. Fury seized Police Chief H. Grady Thompson as details of the killing were given him. With Detective B.V. Atnip and Deputy Sheriff Ollie Nethery, he raced in search of the murderer. Ready to shoot, the officers didn't care whether they took their man dead or alive, but the car had vanished. One man said he had seen it speed east out of the city over Highway number 5. Chief Thompson dashed out the highway as far as the county line, but found no trace of the black sedan. Desk Sergeant J.W. Daniel sat at a telephone all night, pleading with officers for the early arrest of the slayer. Acting on his request, the radio station of the Dallas Police broadcast the tragic story and appealed to civilians for help. Deputy Sheriff Denver Seal of Dallas heard the broadcast. The description reminded him of Clyde Barrow, in search of whom he had spent many fruitless hours. He telephoned his suspicion to Sheriff Frank Reese at Sherman, and early the next morning he sent Reese a number of pictures of Barrow. Witnesses to the murder recognized them at once. They were positive Barrow was the slayer. And just like that, Barrow was wanted for his 3rd murder. The press and the people demanded that something be done to end his bloody career. Officers didn't need to be pressed. They were working day and night. Governor Sterling revoked the Barrow parole on November 17th, and officers scoured the underworld in scores of cities. Wait, the governor just revoked his parole after he's been on a robbing and murdering spree for about a month now? I guess those are the wheels of bureaucracy churning, huh? All right, back to the story. So the governors revoked Barrow's parole. Officers are scouring the underworlds in all kinds of towns and cities, but Barrow did not fall before ordinary police routine. His constant and long dashes were hard to follow. He became the most nomadic of all modern badmen. He drove hundreds of miles in a day, robbing when he needed money. A young woman appeared at the bank of Oronago, Missouri, a few miles from Joplin the afternoon of November 23, 1932. She explained to R.A. Norton, 60-year-old cashier, that she wanted to make an affidavit. As he placed his signature and stamp on the document, the young woman casually studied the interior of the institution. When she was gone, the cashier remembered only that she had very, very yellow hair. A week later, 3 men drove up to the bank in a 1931 model Chevrolet sedan. 1 stayed at the wheel. 2, carrying shotguns, dashed into the bank. Cashier Norton saw them coming. Seizing a revolver in his cage, he opened fire. Cursing, the bandits blazed away. With slugs whining around him, the cashier dropped to his knees. One of the bandits snatched up $115. They ran from the bank, piled into the car, and sped west on Main Street. Vigilantes attracted by the shooting were waiting behind an oil truck a block on. They opened fire as the bandits passed. One of the outlaws smashed a car window, thrust out a shotgun, and sprayed the truck with lead. With both groups firing furiously, the car raced on. A farmer saw the bandits abandon the Chevrolet 3 miles out of town and get into a Ford coupe that was driven by a yellow-haired woman. The car bore a Texas license. The Joplin, Missouri Police Department was called in to help. The woman indicated to us that the Barrow gang had made another of its long jumps and invaded our territory. Checking the deserted Chevrolet, we learned that it had been stolen earlier that day on the street at Carthage, Missouri. Carefully examining tourist camps in the vicinity of Carthage, we found that Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker and 2 men had stayed several days at a camp about 10 miles east of Carthage. Attendants identified their pictures at once. Several days later, we succeeded in identifying the other bandits as Hollis Hale and Frank Hardy, Dallas criminals. We spread the word that Hardy and Hale were traveling with Barrow and Bonnie, but despite our best efforts, the gang eluded us. 5 days later, we learned they were on another of their phenomenal cross-country jaunts. Doyle Johnson parked his car in front of his home at Belton, Texas, the evening of December 5, 1932, and went inside. A few minutes later, he noticed 2 men trying to start it. A woman waited for them in another car. Johnson dashed from the house. One of the thieves shot at him and missed. The shot did not deter Johnson. He rushed on. Climbing onto the running board, he reached for the throat of the outlaw who had attempted to take his life. The other placed the muzzle of his revolver against Johnson's throat and fired. Johnson fell to the pavement dying. The desperados piled into the car with the woman and escaped. A few hours later, witnesses identified pictures of Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Frank Hardy. 4 murders were now charged to Barrow, and still the remarkable luck held. 2 days later, however, the law got a break in its contest with the gang. Raymond Hamilton was arrested by Sheriff W.S. Day when he was observed to be carrying a revolver in a dance hall at Bay City, Michigan. A submachine gun was found in his hotel room. Hamilton said he had split with Barrow after an argument over Bonnie Parker. "He told me she was worth half a dozen of me in a jam," Hamilton complained. "But I must give the girl credit. She is plenty tough. She can handle a pistol with either hand, but those cigars, oh my." When Hamilton was returned to Texas, he received a sentence of 99 years for the Butcher murder, 99 years for a bank robbery in LaGrange County, 25 years for various holdups, and 12 years for motor thefts in Dallas. The state of Oklahoma, satisfied he would be permanently confined, decided not to extradite him for a trial in connection with the murder of Moore at Stringtown. Just before noon, December 31, 1932, 2 bandits rushed into the bank of Grapevine, Texas, scooped up $3,000, and fled in a motor car. A posse gave chase. After a few miles, the bandit car crashed. The outlaws ran into a tract of timber. The posse surrounded them and closed in. 1 man escaped. The other, Les Stewart, was captured. He said his companion was Odell Chandless, a former convict of Dallas. Fleeing toward Dallas, Chandless robbed a milkman near the city limits and continued into town in his truck. Several days later, officers received a tip that Chandless was going to call at the home of Lily McBride, a sister of Raymond Hamilton who lived on County Avenue in West Dallas. January 6, 1933, Lily McBride went to Hillsborough to visit Hamilton in jail there. Officers took advantage of her absence to set a trap for Chandless. Shortly after dark, they took their posts. At about 11:45 p.m., a car drove up. A woman stayed at the wheel with the motor running. A man got out and walked toward the house. Even in the darkness, Deputy Davis recognized Clyde Barrow. Stepping from his cover, he ordered the desperado to halt. Quickly, Barrow whirled. A shotgun flashed. Davis fell dead, shot through the heart. Under a hail of bullets from the house, Barrow ran to the car. Bent low over the wheel, Bonnie Parker sent it speeding into the night. Barrow had committed his 5th murder, and still his luck held. 20 days were to pass before he was seen again, hundreds of miles away. In the meantime, Chandless was arrested at Tampa, Florida, returned to Texas, and sentenced to 35 years in prison. Stewart was sentenced to 25 years. Thomas Purcell, a motorcycle patrolman at Springfield, Missouri, noticed 2 men and a woman eyeing him suspiciously on January 26, 1933. He chased them several blocks to question them. Finally, he forced them to the curb. Before he could draw his revolver, they had their guns on him. They forced him into their car, covered him with a blanket, and drove him out of town. After an all-night search had been conducted for him, Purcell called the Joplin, Missouri police office at 12:30 the next day. He had been released at Poundstone Corner, 12 miles north of Joplin and 200 miles from Springfield. The Joplin office sent for him and heard his story firsthand. His captors admitted they were the Barrow gang, and Bonnie Parker joked about dyeing her hair. It no longer was the distinguished yellow, it was now a vivid red. The outlaws had stopped in several towns: Buffalo, Fairplay, Golden City, Carthage, and some others the officer was unable to identify. From Carthage they came to Joplin, drove through the residential section for a few minutes, and then went on to Onarago. At Onarago they stole a battery to replace the one in their car which had been giving them trouble. From Onarago the outlaws drove to Poundstone Corner, where they released Purcell. When last seen they were speeding west toward Carl Junction. Evidently, the gang drove on to Texas because at Marshall, Texas on January 31st, they stole a Ford coupe from R.F. Rosborough. As usual, they immediately set out on another cross-country swing, and 2 weeks later, Sheriff John E. York found the Rosborough car abandoned near Veneta, Oklahoma. While conjecture ran high as to the probable scene of Clyde's next outbreak, Mrs. Buck Barrow appealed to Governor Ferguson of Texas for her husband's freedom. Mrs. Barrow had been given credit for her husband's return to prison after his escape, and she was given a sympathetic hearing. She urged the fact that Buck's voluntary return to serve his sentence indicated a sincere intent to reform. Her plea was backed by the favorable recommendation of Warden W. W. Wade, Assistant Warden R. H. Bond, Secretary of State W. W. Heath, Henry Owlsley of the State Department, V. G. Isaacoff, Director of the Prison Laboratory, E. W. Anderson, Prison Medical Director, and C. E. Garrett, Methodist Prison Chaplain. Holy moly, she had an entire village backing her up on the request. Buck, Clyde Barrow's brother, was granted a full pardon on March 20th, 1933. He went to Dallas. For 3 weeks he visited his parents and other relatives. Then he packed his suitcase and disappeared with his wife. Police immediately became nervous. Informers were ordered to learn where Buck Barrow could be found. They reported he had told friends he was going to see Clyde, who was reported to be hiding in the Arkansas Ozarks. Mrs. Barrow had told acquaintances that Buck had gotten a letter from his brother. He was going to try to persuade him to surrender and go straight. Was Buck Barrow, pardoned convict, really going to solve the problem? Was he really going to try to reform his murderous brother, Clyde Bloody Barrow? Or did his disappearance foreshadow trouble? In less than a week, law enforcement had the answer. And of all the Bloody Barrow crimes to date, the one to come was to be the worst. Sergeant G.B. Collar of the Missouri State Highway Patrol stationed at Joplin was directing his men in the annual roundup of motorists whose cars were not licensed properly when he received a telephone report early in April that several cars bearing tags from out of the state had been behind a garage near 34th Street and Oak Ridge Drive in the Freeman's Grove Addition, a suburb of Joplin. For several days he was too busy to investigate it, but his attention was returned to the matter by an agitated man who went to the sergeant's office and demanded that something be done at once. Vaguely the man hinted that something sinister was taking place out in Freeman's Grove. He pictured persons darting in and out of the living quarters above the garage like frightened animals. Sergeant Collar telephoned Ed Portley, the chief of detectives in Joplin, and asked him if he had received any complaints about the place. Portley said he had not. Collar said he was going to look into the situation. The place, Collar found, was a 2-story stone building on the north side of 34th Street, about 150 feet east of Oak Ridge Drive. On the ground floor was a double garage. A door at the left of the garage entrance as one faced the building opened on a stairway that led to living quarters over the garage. People in the neighborhood were shy and evasive. They didn't want to talk. Plainly, for some reason the sergeant could not determine, they feared the men and women living over the garage. However, Mac Parker, a private watchman in the neighborhood, told of going to the house in uniform on one of his nightly rounds and informing the occupants that he would guard them against burglars for a fee of $1 a month. They received him cordially and employed him. He added the name Callahan to his list of clients. It was the story of a laundryman that convinced Collar something was seriously amiss. The laundryman said the persons living in the building had been his customers for 2 weeks. When he returned their first bundle, the door at the foot of the stairway flew open before he could knock. A small, apparently frightened woman with vivid red hair confronted him. With trembling hands, she reached for the bundle. "I'll carry it upstairs for you," the laundryman offered. "It's almost as big as you are." "No," the woman spoke crisply. "I'll take it. You wait." The laundryman insisted. The woman, glancing nervously up the steps, remained firm, took the bundle upstairs, then descended and paid her bill. The scene repeated the next week. The laundryman got the impression that the woman was deathly afraid for him to see something or someone on the second floor. Sergeant Collar believed he'd stumbled onto a bootleg liquor plant and decided to raid the place. He explained his intention to Chief of Detectives Ed Portley, who assigned Detectives Thomas DeGraff and Harry L. McGinnis to aid him. Collar took Patrolman W.E. Grammer from his own office. Freeman's Grove is just outside Jasper County, so it was necessary for the officers to go to Neosho, Missouri, county seat of Newton County, for a search warrant. There, they added Constable Wes Harriman of Saginaw, Missouri, to the raiding party. The officers swung south out of Joplin's Main Street in 2 cars. As they turned west into 34th Street, Sergeant Collar and Patrolman Grammer were in the lead. DeGraff and Harriman rode on the front seat of the trailing police car, with McGinnis on the rear seat. The plan was to drive around the block before making the raid, but as Collar drove past the house, he saw 2 men standing in the garage door. At the sight of the uniformed state officers, they banged the door shut. "Stop! Stop!" Collar shouted, jamming on his brakes. The garage door opened a crack. A blast from a shotgun sprayed the car with lead. As the state car slid to a halt, DeGraff, driving the police car, whirled the steering wheel and drove straight into the withering fire from the garage. He did not stop until both of the doors of the garage were blocked and the exposed officers were within a dozen feet of the outlaws, who were protected by the stone building. The odds hopelessly against him, Constable Harriman drew his revolver and stepped from the car. His weapon barked once. 10 shotgun slugs tore through his neck and left shoulder. He was dead before he could fire again. Detective McGinnis leaped out. This time his pistol cracked. As he pulled the trigger a 4th time, the arm holding the weapon was ripped off at the elbow. Buckshot showered his face and head. He dropped, unconscious. DeGraff slid from beneath the wheel. Crouched beside the car, he emptied his gun through the garage doors at the assailants he could not see. Evidently sensing that DeGraff's weapon was empty, one of the outlaws dashed from the building, sweeping everything before him with a Browning automatic rifle. Reloading as rapidly as possible, DeGraff was forced to retreat around the east side of the building. Sergeant Collar ran from the state car as soon as it stopped, closely followed by Patrolman Grammer. Grammer took a position between the garage and the large stone house that stood a few yards west of it. He worked toward the rear of the garage. Collar, in the open, his only weapon a revolver, fought a single-handed duel with the Browning-armed desperado. 4 times Collar pitted his puny weapon against the automatic, slowly walking backward toward the corner of the house to the west. Then, suddenly, he tripped over a chicken wire support for the flowers. Taking advantage of the situation, the outlaw darted into the police car and fought to release the brake. Hurriedly drawing himself into a sitting position, Collar took deliberate aim and sent his last shot at the killer. The man screamed with pain and dropped. Furiously, the sergeant reloaded. Stiffly, the outlaw struggled to his feet and staggered into the garage. Striving for a position of advantage, Grammer and DeGraff met behind the garage. "Telephone for help! Get it quick!" Detective DeGraff shouted. Running desperately, Grammer went to a neighboring house and telephoned the Joplin police office. In an instant, detectives were speeding to the battle. Just one question was in Ed Portley's mind. Would they be there in time? As the wounded man entered the garage, another outlaw ran out. Jerking free the brake on the police car, he gave the car a shove. Slowly it coasted down the inclined driveway, gathering speed. Crazily, it swung across 34th Street and crashed against a red oak tree on the south side of the street. The garage doors were unobstructed. Inside the garage, the motor of an automobile roared. A hysterical woman suddenly burst from the garage and ran east down the street. With a grinding of gears, the motor car swept out of the garage. 3 men and a woman were in it, all spraying lead. Desperately, the living officers carried on. The outlaws slowed down as they reached the fleeing woman. A man reached out and grabbed her into the car. The machine gained speed. His gun empty, Sergeant Collar scribbled the license number of the Marmon car as it raced from sight. It was Texas number 279-797. The murderers were gone when reinforcements arrived. The officers divided into groups. One group dashed after the desperados and the others entered the building, seeking clues as to the identities of the fugitives. Detective McGinnis, his life completely despaired of, was rushed immediately to St. John's Hospital, where he died 4 hours later. Men, under the direction of Chief of Detectives Ed Portley, frantically spread over the countryside, searching highways and byways for the escaping killers. George Clemens, a garage operator at 34th and Main Street, saw the bullet-marked car speed past. One man was bent over as though in terrible pain. At that point, law enforcement lost trace of the desperate crew for a moment. It was 4:30 p.m. on April 13, 1933. In one of the 2 rooms over the garage, officers found a meal in preparation. On the dining table was a sheet of paper carrying some penned lines that gave an extraordinary sidelight on the character of one member of this desperate gang. The ink was still wet. With exclamations of astonishment, the officers read this bit of doggerel. Doggerel being a derogatory term for amateur poetry. The poem was entitled The Story of Suicide Sal by Bonnie Parker. So guys, here's what I'm gonna do. Bonnie Parker's poem is pretty long. I can't bring myself to skip it. You gotta hear it, but I also don't want to exit the narrative for too long. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna take our ad break here, except it won't be an ad break. Instead, I'm gonna skip ads and read you the entirety of Bonnie Parker's poem. When we come back, we'll jump right back into the story. So if you don't care about her poem, I mean, shame on you, but go ahead and skip through it. Suicide Sal by Bonnie Parker. We, each of us, have a good alibi for being down here in the joint. But few of them are really justified if you get right down to the point. You've heard of a woman's glory being spent on a downright cur. Still, you can't always judge the story as true being told by her. As long as I stayed on the island and heard confidence tales from the gals, there was only one interesting and truthful. It was the story of Suicide Sal. Now, Sal was a girl of rare beauty, though her features were somewhat tough. She never once faltered from duty to play on the up and up. Sal told me this tale on the evening before she was turned out free, and I'll do my best to relate it, just as she told it to me. I was born on a ranch in Wyoming, not treated like Helen of Troy. I was taught that rods were rulers, and ranked as a greasy cowboy. Then I left my old home for the city to play in its mad dizzy whirl, not knowing how little of pity it holds for a country girl. There I fell for the line of a henchman, a professional killer from Chi. I couldn't help loving him madly. For him even I would die. One year we were desperately happy. Our ill-gotten gains we spent free. I was taught the ways of the underworld. Jack was like a god to me. I got on the FBA payroll to get the inside lay of the job. The bank was churning big money. It looked like a cinch for the mob. 80 grand without even a rumble. Jack was the last with the loot in the door, when the teller dead-aimed a revolver from where they forced him to lie on the floor. I knew I had only a moment. He would surely get Jack as he ran, so I staged a big fade out beside him and knocked the .45 out of his hand. They rapped me down big at the station and informed me that I'd get the blame for the dramatic stunt pulled on the teller looked to them too much like a game. The police called it a frame-up, said it was an inside job, but I steadily denied any knowledge or dealings with underworld mobs. The gang hired a couple of lawyers, the best fixers in any man's town, but it takes more than lawyers and money when Uncle Sam starts shaking you down. I was charged as a scion of gangland and tried for my wages of sin. The dirty dozen found me guilty, from 5 to 50 years in the pen. I took the rap like good people, and never one squawk did I make. Jack dropped himself on the promise that we'd make a sensational break. Well, to shorten a sad, lengthy story, 5 years have gone over my head, without even so much as a letter. At first, I thought he was dead. But not so long ago, I discovered, from a gal in the joint named Lyle, that Jack and his moll had got over, and were living in true gangster style. If he had returned to me sometime, though he hadn't a cent to give, I'd forget all the hell that he'd caused me, and love him as long as I lived. But there's no chance of that ever coming, for he and his moll have no fears that I will die in this prison, or flatten this 50 years. Tomorrow I'll be on the outside, and I'll drop 'em myself on it today. I'll bump 'em if they give me the hot squat on this island out here in the bay. The iron doors swung wide next morning for a gruesome woman of waste, who at last had a chance to fix it. Murder showed on her cynical face. Not long ago I read in the paper that a gal on the east side got hot, and when the smoke finally retreated, 2 of gangdom were found on the spot. It related a colorful story of a jilted gangster gal. 2 days later a sub-gun ended. The story of Suicide Sal. So that was the poem that officers discovered at the abandoned house on 34th Street in Freeman's Grove, from which the outlaws had just fled following the gun battle. Police were appalled. The Bloody Barrows had killed for the 6th and 7th time. With 5 dead men mutely accusing her from the grave, Bonnie Parker had been able to pen such a poem as this, and then she'd been able to lay down her pen and calmly take part in 2 more murders. Such obvious evidence of pride in her shameful crimes infuriated the officers who had just seen their bleeding comrades. 5 high-powered rifles and a revolver were dragged out of the closet. In a suitcase were found 3 official-looking documents. One of them was the certificate of pardon issued just 3 weeks before to Buck Barrow. Another was the certificate that marked the marriage of Buck to Blanche Caldwell while he was a fugitive from the Texas Penitentiary in 1931. The third was a motor car registration certificate issued to Carl Beatty, 1010 East Jefferson Street, Dallas, Texas. It was for a 1929 Marmon sedan, Texas license number 279-797, motor number T-8692. The killers had escaped in that car. Could Carl Beatty have been the third man in the gang? Joplin's chief of detectives hurried a telegram to the Dallas police asking them to check up on him. One other discovery seemed to have some potential value as evidence. It was a camera containing a roll of film. Rushing the film to a photographer, police waited impatiently while it was developed. Great as had been the challenge of Bonnie's poem, it was mild compared to the taunt that screamed at law enforcement from the finished photographs. In the center of 3 pictures was the stag-handled revolver taken from Officer Purcell at Springfield. It was evident that the outlaws considered the Purcell episode a great joke. In one picture, Clyde Barrows, smiling broadly, wore the weapon in a holster. Facing him, with a shotgun held at his stomach, Bonnie Parker reached her left hand to the weapon. And if you guys have checked out Kinda Murdery's social media, whether Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, by the way, I created a short promotional video for the Bonnie and Clyde story that includes the photos that are being referred to here. So if you haven't seen them, go check it out at Kinda Murdery on any social media. The revolver in the other pictures hung on the radiator cap of a Ford bearing 1933 Texas license number 587-956. A collection of shotguns and rifles leaned against the bumper. Clyde posed with the guns in one instance and Buck in the other. A 4th exposure showed Bonnie in front of the car. A 5th showed Buck and his wife, Blanche Caldwell Barrow. The pictures were unusually clear. Because they were the latest likenesses of the badly wanted criminals, Chief of Detectives Ed Portley ordered hundreds of copies made, and as fast as they were printed, mailed them to other officers. After 2 days of terrific work, he received a telephone call from Detective Lieutenant J.W. Fritz at Dallas. His men had found Carl Beatty. Lieutenant Fritz explained that Beatty was an absolutely reputable man and had made a sworn statement concerning the Marmon escape car. I received the statement in the mail the next morning. Beatty said he had known Buck Barrow 10 years. He had sold him the Marmon March 29th and had received 2 Ford Coupes and $100 in payment. The identity of the third man in the gang remained as deep a mystery as ever. Joplin detectives worked anxiously through the discouraging days to obtain some fresh trace of the Barrow gang. More and more, they became convinced that the Bloody Barrows had set off on another of their migratory flights through the country. Consequently, they widened the scope of their appeal until almost every community in the nation was reached. Confirmation of the theory was not long in coming. Pictures of the much-wanted criminals appeared in the Cleveland, Ohio newspaper the morning of April 18th. That afternoon, Steve Fronius of 12903 Oakfield Avenue, an employee of the Walsh Transportation Company, picked up 2 women hitchhikers at 79th Street and Euclid Avenue. They told them they were from Dallas, Texas, and intended visiting in turn Columbus, Chillicothe, Ohio, and Annapolis, Maryland. By the way, guys, I don't always have time to look up the correct pronunciations of every place, so I apologize if I horribly butcher any of these place names, like Chillicothe, for example. Please feel free to reach out, kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on social media, and correct me. I'd love to be corrected. I'd love to meet you. I'll send you some Kinda Murdery stickers. All right, back to the story. So the women who said they were from Texas had a list of places they were planning to visit. So, directing them to United States Highway number 42, Fronius let the women out at 9th Street and Prospect Avenue. A few hours later, they appeared at the office of the Walsh Transportation Company, explaining that they had left a pair of riding boots in the car. They obtained the boots and left, but not before several persons saw them. That night, when Fronius read his morning paper, he recognized Blanche Caldwell Barrow and Bonnie Parker as his passengers of earlier in the day. He hurried to the office of George J. Matowitz, chief of police, where he told his story. Matowitz notified Joplin, and they rushed pictures of the women to him by airmail. Soon, the Joplin police had word from Matowitz that the pictures had been identified by Fronius and 6 others who saw the women. The police of a dozen Ohio cities snapped into action, trying to draw the fugitives into a trap. The question arose as to what had become of the men in the gang. None of the witnesses had seen men with the women. Was it possible that the deluge of publicity had sent them to cover, that it had put an end to their mad dashes? Police hoped it had. They felt it would be easier to capture them if they held to one locality. With startling decisiveness, the delusions that the police entertained on that score were swept aside. B.D. Darby, an undertaker, sat in his boarding house at Rushton, Louisiana, the evening of April 27th, talking to Miss Sophie Stone of Mansfield, Louisiana, home demonstration agent for Lincoln Parish. His motor car was parked in front of the house. Miss Stone's car stood directly behind it. Uttering a sudden exclamation, I imagine something like, "What the hell?" Darby leapt to his feet and dashed out the door. Surprised at the sudden interruption of the quiet conversation, Miss Stone followed. Darby's car was moving away from the curb. In it were 3 men and 2 women. One of the men waved and called back, "Thanks, buddy." "Why, they're stealing my car," the undertaker shouted. "Get in mine, let's follow 'em," Miss Stone urged. With the courageous Miss Stone beside him, Darby fell in behind the thieves. The outlaws speeded up, but Darby kept the pace. Miles flashed by. Neither car seemed to gain an advantage. Then, near Hyco, the thieves began to draw away. It was obvious Darby could not catch them. Unless he did something at once, they would escape. The nearest town was Hyco. If he could reach officers there in time, his car might be saved. Spinning around, Darby raced for the town. Miss Stone looked back over her shoulder. A cry of alarm escaped her. "They're following us." A glance told Darby she was right. The outlaws were chasing them. Fear for the safety of the brave woman seized the man. Thrusting the accelerator down hard, he hurled the car over the highway, but foot by foot the criminals gained. Swinging alongside, they forced Darby to a ditch. Guns bristling in their hands, the thieves piled from Darby's car. "You're not so smart, bucko. Hop out of there." Roughly, the outlaws pushed Darby and Miss Stone into the stolen car, swung it around, and sped north. When Darby and Miss Stone failed to return to the boarding house, Sheriff A.J. Thigpen of Rushton was notified. Quickly, he placed all highways from the city under guard, but the outlaws slipped through. Several hours passed. The silence concerning Darby and Miss Stone remained unbroken as time ticked away. Sheriff Thigpen's telephone rang about 8 o'clock. "Oh, thank God they're safe," he exclaimed as he hung up the receiver. Darby and Miss Stone, after a ride of 125 miles, had been released near Magnolia, Arkansas. Their captors gave them $5 on which to return home. They hurried to Magnolia, where they reported their release to officers. While they telephoned Rushton, Magnolia authorities rushed after the outlaws. The stolen car was sighted passing through Hope, Arkansas, some 300 miles south of Joplin at about 8 o'clock. Then, the Ozark Hills seemed to swallow it. Believing that the kidnappers might continue north, Sheriff Thigpen telephoned Chief of Detectives Ed Portley in Joplin. This next section of the story is told in Chief Portley's own words. The gang sounded like the Barrows. I had learned that they sometimes worked in Arkansas. In the stock of one of the rifles taken after the Joplin murders, I found a receipt showing that the weapon had been purchased by a man in Bowles, Scott County, about 100 miles from Hope, Arkansas. It had been stolen from him. I asked Sheriff Thigpen to have the victims view pictures of the Barrow gang. A little later, he called me again. He'd intercepted Darby and Miss Stone at Waldo, Arkansas. They had identified the Barrow brothers, Mrs. Blanche Caldwell Barrow and Bonnie Parker, but there was no inkling of the identity of the third man. While possemen poured into the hills of northwestern Arkansas, Joplin police distributed thousands of posters offering a reward of $1,000 for the arrest of the Barrow brothers. The governor of Missouri offered 400 of the amount, Joplin 200, Jasper County 200, and Newton County 200. Warned by the long jump from Cleveland to Louisiana that the killers could still be expected almost anywhere, police all over the Midwest and Southwest waited alertly. The feared news came suddenly. The gangsters dashed into Broken Bow, Oklahoma near the point of their disappearance after the Louisiana kidnapping on the evening of April 28th. Brutally beating an attendant, they robbed a filling station of a few dollars. With officers close on them, the killers raced west through Hugo and Durant, and finally, under the cover of night, they apparently circled to the safety of the hills. 2 weeks passed. Exhausting every device known to police work, law enforcement failed utterly to find the least trace of the desperados. A bandit ran into a filling station at Fort Dodge, Iowa, May 16, 1933, robbed the attendant and escaped in a car which had been left parked a block away. The attendant was unable to tell whether other persons were in the car. The victim was reporting the robbery in the office of John P. Lecrae, chief of police, when his eyes fell on a reward poster tacked to the wall. "Why, there's the man!" he exclaimed. He pointed to a picture of Buck Barrow. The gang had made another of its long sweeps. 3 days later, 2 men and 2 women drove into Okabena, Minnesota, 130 miles north in a dark green Ford V8 sedan. One of the women had bright red hair. The car stopped. The red-headed woman stayed at the wheel. The men swooped into the First State Bank. Driving bank officers and employees before them, they herded them into a vault, took $2,500, and ran to the car. The holdup had been witnessed. Townspeople opened fire from the sidewalks. Bullets thudded into the body of the car as it pulled away. Knocking glass from the windows, the bandits enveloped the street in a shower of flying lead. The 2 men used shotguns and one of the women a high-powered rifle. For a moment, the battle raged furiously, but it was impossible to face the outlaw barrage and live. Slowly, the defenders fell back into the shelter of buildings and the bandits escaped. Bank employees identified pictures of the Barrow gang. The Minnesota State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension joined the Iowa State Bureau of Investigation in an effort to hem in the bandits. Roads were barricaded. Investigators went into the underworlds of the larger cities, ready to mark any newcomers, and marshals in smaller towns carefully questioned all strangers. While that energetic effort was being made, the law won another point in its battle with the gang. Frank Hardy and Hollis Hale were arrested at Waco when they called on a young woman who had been shadowed after it became known she associated with the fugitives. Hardy was taken to the county jail at Temple, Texas, to be held for trial in connection with the murder of Doyle Johnson. Hale was returned to Missouri and questioned carefully. He confirmed every detail of the Onarago bank robbery as it had been constructed by the police, but he could tell them nothing of the whereabouts of the Barrow brothers who had slipped through the net spread for them in Minnesota and Iowa. Hard as he was, Hale admitted he had left the Barrow gang because they were too desperate. He was sentenced to 20 years in Missouri Penitentiary for his part in the Onarago robbery. It was with satisfaction that the police saw him off to prison, but the bigger problem, the capture of the Barrow brothers themselves, was as far from a solution as ever. They had again dropped out of sight, but heartbreaking past experience told law enforcement that they would not be missing long. And indeed, that dread assumption would prove true. Steve Pritchard, a farmer living on the Salt Fork River 7 miles north of Wellington, Texas, sat on his front porch on Saturday night, April 10, 1933, talking to Lonzo Carter, who lived at the Pritchard home. Pritchard heard the roar of a motor. Looking up, he saw a car speeding down the highway toward them. It was only a few hundred miles away. "Well, gee, that fellow is really traveling," he remarked to Carter. Before Carter could answer, the car lurched over an embankment and disappeared. In an instant, flames leaped high in the darkness. Bounding to their feet, Pritchard and Carter sprinted toward the scene of the accident. The fire burned brighter. As they neared, they could see the car. It had landed top down. And we're going to pause our story right here. Did all the members of the Bloody Barrow gang survive the crash? Is their reign of terror ended? Or is this just one more hiccup in their seemingly indefatigable quest to rain robbery and murder across 2/3 of the United States? Please do join me this Sunday, August 28th, for part 3 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. I look forward to seeing you there. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers, leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.